We are pleased to have a really distinguished panel for our session on strategies for managing access and reimbursement challenges. I will be your chair. I'm Katy Spink. I'm Chief Operating Officer and Managing Partner at Dark Horse Consulting. And I'm pleased to be joined by Eric Faulkner, who is Vice President Global Real-World Evidence at Novartis Gene Therapies. Kristin Wolff, who's Vice President Global Policy Strategy and U.S. Government Payer at Bluebird Bio. And Sarah Pitluck, who is Head Global Pricing and Reimbursement at Spark Therapeutics. We've got a few prepared questions to start things off, but we're going to try to reserve about the last 15 minutes for any audience questions, so please be thinking about whether you have any questions to ask of our distinguished panelists. So just to get us started and set the stage, I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce, for those in the audience who may be new to this topic, some of the unique challenges to reimbursement and market access for advanced therapy products, as well as some of the innovative approaches that are being considered to address those challenges. And I'm going to ask Sarah to start us off. I know you have innovated some new approaches for Spark, who was one of the early movers in this space, and tell us a little bit about what you did there.
For sure. I feel like I'm in pricing jail, which is never a good place to be when you're a pricing and reimbursement person. A little wigged out about the, the plastic things. But no, I'll talk about Luxturna specifically. For those who don't know about Luxturna, what we did from a pricing and reimbursement standpoint. We were the first gene therapy to be approved by the FDA at the end of 2017. We knew we had a precedent to set, and we knew we had some challenges that we had to overcome. We started with making a list of all the challenges. Luxturna, beside being the first FDA-approved gene therapy, we knew it was going to be available for a limited number of patients. These patients had to have a confirmed diagnosis, a genetic diagnosis of RPE65, inherited retinal disease. There are not a lot of them out there, so we had to find them and make sure that they had a confirmed diagnosis. Then we knew we had very limited durability data at launch. We had about 8 to 9 years of durability data for our phase 1/2 clinical trial program, but our phase 3 program, we only had 3 years of durability data at launch, and we're continuing to collect the durability data, but we had to set a price for a one-time therapy based on 3 years of durability data for a product that we expected to last a much longer time. We also had a one-time therapy versus the chronic administered therapy, so that was new for many products in the US. And we also knew that we had a limited number of treatment centers. We had 10 ocular gene therapy treatment centers that we established across the US, so patients would have to travel to a gene therapy treatment center if they didn't live in a state where there was a center located. And we had a limited number of physicians that would actually diagnose the patients and that would treat the patients. So we had these barriers, and then you add on top of it the government price reporting requirements that we're going to talk about a little bit later, and we didn't know what to do. So where do we start? We invested a lot of time and resources to talk to people, like a lot of time and resources to talk to people. We talked to payers, both public and private. We talked to physicians, both administering physicians and referring physicians. We talked to investors. We talked to the media. We talked to the patient groups. We talked to patients themselves. We talked to caregivers. We talked to communication experts. We talked to coders to determine, what codes we could use for reimbursement. We talked to everyone, and we gathered knowledge from all these people and said, what can we do to address the big issues? And we came up with a three-pronged approach. But first, we had to actually determine a price, or the value, and we used some economic modeling to do that, the traditional economic modeling that you see health technology agencies use. But then we also want to be a little creative and unique, and we looked at a couple of different sources of pricing information to corroborate what we found from the economic model. And those sources were policies and payouts from long-term disability claims, and policies and awards given to patients based on jury awards who had lost their sight. We really wanted to put a value on someone's sight. Very, very difficult to do, but we wanted to make sure the numbers matched that, somewhat similarly to the numbers we got from the economic model. So after we determined our price, we said we didn't want to just take a price and shove it down people's throats and then walk away. We really wanted to put together a reimbursement environment that was positive for both patients, payers, and the providers. So we gave people a menu of options. We let them decide the payers, the commercial payers, if they wanted to risk share with us. We offered to give money back for the product if it didn't work, both in the short term and the long term. And that was a unique aspect. As a first-time gene therapy, we wanted to prove the durability. So we said we will give money back if it doesn't work within 30 to 90 days, and we'll also give money back if it doesn't work within 30 to 33 months. And that was very appealing to the payers to have a risk-sharing agreement both in the short and the long term. Second thing we did was that we offered a unique, innovative outcome contracting solution with payers. We call it the Spark Path, or the Patient Access to Healthcare. And that is where we provide the drug and sell the drug to payers or their specialty pharmacy directly. So the providers don't have to buy and bill. There's not a lot of claims processing. The providers don't mark up the drug. The payers can pay at a WAC or at the list price of the drug. And they have to agree to requirements for the patient, such as making sure that the out-of-pocket cost sharing would be at an in-network rate, so it would help the patients as well. And then finally, we did a proposal to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to ask them to do a demonstration project to look at new ways in which we could offer alternative funding arrangements for one-time gene therapies. We wanted to offer greater rebates and not have it impact our government price reporting. And we wanted to have the option to offer payment over time to test out these new ideas, being the first to sort of set the stage, particularly in a small patient population, to see if it would work for future gene therapies. And although our demonstration project didn't go through, we have had very, very productive conversations with the agency, with the administration, and a lot of the concepts that we put forth in our demonstration project have been implemented or have at least been suggested in the value-based purchasing final agreement that we'll talk about later. But overall, we knew we had these challenges. We came up with a good, very fair and reasonable price, a good menu of options, and it's been implemented incredibly well in the US. We haven't had a single patient who has been eligible for treatment who has not received it.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Kristin, anything to add to that?
I actually just wanted to, I don't know if my mic is working here. I wanted to pull up on a couple of themes that were in the remarks that Sarah just gave that Bluebird has also found to be true in our work. For those who are not familiar with Bluebird Bio, in the US, we're still a clinical stage company. So we have 3 late-stage development candidates in beta thalassemia, sickle cell disease, and a rare metabolic condition, cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy. In Europe, we actually have 2 approved gene therapies, one for beta thalassemia and the other for cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy. So my remarks today sort of stem our experience on the European side as well as the US side. The theme I really wanted to pull from Sarah's remarks that we've seen as well are the challenges that cell and gene therapies face in general fall into 2 categories. Those that are unique to the one-time administered, potentially curative nature of cell and gene therapies, and those that are relatively more common, no pun intended, to therapies that target rare diseases. So to give the audience a couple of examples here, with a one-time administered, potentially curative therapy, the fact that our entire reimbursement systems around the world, but especially in Europe and the US, have entirely been geared, have grown up around providing chronic disease therapies, means that the paradigm shift of one-time administered, potentially curative, poses a challenge that's pervasive in every single step of the process, from formal or informal health technology assessments all the way through things like claims processing, which often requires an actual administration to have occurred, making something like payment over time really challenging just from a logistical perspective. On the other side of this, when you think about a rare disease, one of the biggest pieces that we've found is the importance of really not only explaining, but getting buy-in from payers, from all of the communities that are involved in the access paradigm with things like unmet need, burden of disease, impact across the patient's and their caregiver's lifespan. And when you think about that in the context of a cell or a gene therapy, it's not just between administrations, but really the full course of the potential impact of that therapy. So I thought I'd pull those 2 themes because what we're finding is they each compound each other when you're working in a rare disease space with a cell and gene therapy, and I would completely agree that early engagement and engagement with as many audiences as possible and coming to the equation as a company with as much humility as you can has really been where we've seen success, what's driven that success.
Great. And Eric?
Yeah, thank you. And, I agree wholeheartedly with both points that have been made. On the one hand, if you look at, the Spark scenario, the world is open for creativity here, more so than in some other areas, because you have to prove transformative effect. What is transformative effect? It's all relative to the disease area. And then to the other point, that each step along the way, it's not that some of the steps are new, it's just that you have to think about them very carefully because you can't take anything for granted. So in the foundation of success is based on your evidence base and your ability to define transformative effect and prove it out. And the clinical trials, especially in the rare disease space, small numbers. So when Zolgensma launched, it was a very small initial clinical trial that supported the launch, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. The reality is that you have one of the challenges is that there are fast-track programs. Fast-track programs in payer world can be, if you're not careful, the route to non-reimbursement. Because you have to have the evidence, and plan ahead. If you need to be thinking about your real-world evidence at the same time you're thinking about clinical, because how do you gap fill? How do you answer other questions that the payers have? And so, from our standpoint, we invested in a very comprehensive registry with a detailed protocol. It may not be necessary to have that level of investment for everyone, but with every disease, there's some unique decision-making that goes along into, how broad to build and scale and other factors. But we also have partnerships. So rare disease is basically permeated by islands of data often, or either maybe there's not a whole lot of data depending on the rare disease. But where there are islands of data, partnerships working together are super important. The patient advocacy organizations, the academic groups that are the registry holders, to ensure that you've got enough evidence, not only because evidence in this space, it's a journey, not a destination. So once you plant the flag and you get there for reimbursement, that's just the start. In some cases, payers will come back and ask for things, additional issues for risk-sharing agreements you may have in place, so they're looking at the evidence, particularly in an environment where there are competitor products. So you have to have the evidence to be able to clarify. The other issue is, with a small trial, you can't cover every eventuality of subpopulations, so you have to have a vehicle by which to help characterize value in other subpopulations that may not have been included to ensure the broadest and most rapid potential to make a transformative therapy available to patients. The other point that I guess I would make is that don't be afraid to think out of the box, because success here is not following a rule book. You're writing the rule book as you go. The rule books are being written, right now, and think about how you can be creative in this space to find, a way forward to help optimize access to your therapy. And as we're launching in now upwards of 40 markets, basically putting a gene therapy in markets that have never seen an advanced therapy, part of it is, all of the stakeholders are coming up a very steep learning curve. The governments, the providers, the payer and HTA organizations, the regulators in various geographies, and really part of it is be creative and have a dialogue. It's a communication. If you need to identify patients through a diagnostic method, if you need to basically work out how to address long-term follow-up. So in the markets that we're going into, roughly 70% of them have a requirement for long-term follow-up. And how do you address that? How do you leverage your real-world evidence to address multiple, issues to help inform and sort of chart that way forward in markets that are also still at the very beginning of a learning curve outside of the US and traditional EU5 markets.
Great, thank you. So speaking of rewriting the rules, field. And I understand significant progress has been made on this recently in the form of the final rule that was adopted in late 2020. And I'm wondering if the panel can comment, maybe I'll throw this to you, Sarah, because I know that you were quite involved in advocating for this. You can comment on the extent to which it has addressed the challenges and what perhaps still may remain to be done.
We're making good progress, right? We got a final rule proposed by CMS that had a lot of technical details in it and a lot of questions that still weren't answered. We have a lot of work to do to get the rule implemented. We're waiting for the administration to put out some guidance to address a lot of the questions that I know us as a manufacturer, ARM, other groups have provided questions to the agency and requests for clarification. But it's a great first step. It shows the willingness to look at different alternative payment arrangements for one-time therapies to allow exemptions to best price if you are giving greater rebates. If you are offering the same thing to Medicaid payers and to commercial payers, it's allowing for some of that flexibility. It clarified that we can allow payment over time as a manufacturer. So it's made some great strides in the right direction, but we really are still waiting to see how the agency is going to implement it, and more importantly, how payers and providers, for the most part, are going to adopt it. So we have some big unknowns yet, but baby steps, particularly when you're dealing with government and policy issues. I think every little baby step helps, and so we've made a few.
Could I actually dive in a little bit deeper there to say, the final rule really represents the most creative that CMS could be, given the limitations they have with existing statute. So I think that the final rule is a huge step forward, the biggest CMS could have taken, given the statutory restrictions they have in federal law. In that respect, when we think about next steps, a lot of those next steps really fall on legislative action at the federal level if we're going to give the agency even more flexibility to do exactly what Sarah was talking about, which is make further advancements. One of the really key pieces, and this is the one thing I would leave the audience with as a takeaway too, that was central to the final rule being successful, is the broad definition that CMS included for an eligible value-based purchasing arrangement. The breadth of that definition to be both include evidence-based as well as outcomes-based metrics was critical, and that's what has to be preserved, and I know that's what ARM is really working toward in their engagements, especially on the Hill, moving forward, because it sounds trite, but one size does not fit all. That is the thing that we have absolutely learned. One size doesn't even fit all with the same payer for a similar patient population for the same product. So that level, I think, to me, the biggest evolution in CMS's thinking was preserving that flexibility for manufacturers and for payers, and taking this step at all in the first place. I think when we think about federal legislation and the role that that could play, regulation is fantastic, but regulation can change. And in this way, it changed for the better. It could certainly, there are questions out about whether it could change again. And for a manufacturer to commit to a contracting strategy that's reliant on regulation involves some amount of risk. And so codifying key pieces of that final rule in legislation would be an excellent next step and an opportunity to really push the envelope even further.
Thank you.
And I think that on a broader level, best price is one example of scenarios where the world wasn't built with cell and gene therapies in mind, and part of it is understanding where are the pressure points, but also, the single administration, everything revolves, for single administration therapies, everything changes and revolves around the single administration. It drives things. There are issues like health system impacts and efficiencies that these technologies may bring that go outside of anything that we've had to really think about from a regulatory or payer side as well. And how do we redefine value? These therapies are redefining our approaches for value. So on the real-world evidence side, for example, there are rules about, in some markets, what real-world evidence can be shared and what can't in a dossier and other things. And we're also moving towards evidence as a journey, not a destination, not just for cell and gene, but for everything. So we have to think about how do we need to rethink certain elements of systems to be able to accommodate transformative therapies that have unique characteristics.
So when we're talking about pricing and reimbursement, and especially with you on the stage, Kristin, I think that the elephant in the room is Bluebird's recent announcement that it's exiting Europe due to a, quote, untenable pricing and reimbursement environment. I'm wondering if you can share with us a little bit more about the dynamics that you encountered there and what some of the challenges were that led to that decision.
Sure, and I really appreciate the opportunity to address that here and then maybe draw some compare and contrast with the US market. So on the European side, it's important to start with the reality that for a small or medium-sized gene therapy company, the barriers to success in Europe are high. In fact, our ability to operate and bring our therapies to patients is predicated on being able to realize the value of our therapies across healthcare markets, not just in one healthcare market in Europe. And I think what we saw and really what drove that decision was the reality that we couldn't sustain operations in the face of prolonged negotiations with healthcare systems, especially as it became increasingly clear that the full value of our gene therapies wasn't being recognized. The systems weren't ready to recognize that full value. As we look to the US for our gene therapies, I think one of the key differentiators really is that ability for the system to recognize the full value of a gene therapy, not just the value that's necessarily, or to get outside of that chronic disease paradigm in even measuring the value or assessing the value, to get outside of the paradigm of looking at just direct costs in a single budget year. And we've seen evidence of the system in the US being able to do that for therapies that have come before us. And we actually have been in the market in the US talking to payers, providers, patient advocacy groups, provider advocacy organizations for years, upwards of 2 or 3 years. That gives us the confidence that that true unmet medical need, the clinical value of our therapy we're in a much better position to have it recognized here than what we ultimately found in Europe.
Great, thank you for that.
I would like to add something, if that's
Sure.
okay, because Spark sold our ex-US rights for Luxturna to Novartis in 2018, and Eric could probably speak to it much more, but I've been very involved with helping Novartis get access globally, and they've had great success for it. So I think that there are different situations for different disease states, for different products, for different price points. Novartis has done a fabulous job about taking the economic model, making the price was set very reasonably, it's cost effective. They've had to do a lot of work to get there, and that's, I think, one of the overall takeaways that I know. I've been working in the European market for over 10 years, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of negotiations with payers, but the low patient numbers, the reasonable price for Luxturna has allowed them to have really good success in getting patient access in Europe. So I do think that it can change based on the product and the disease state. It is certainly not easy for any of the experiences that we've had, but I want to give credit where credit's due, and Novartis has done a very good job of that outside the US.
And I think, Sarah, those are some great points. And a lot of the commentary in the wake of Bluebird's decision in Europe really did focus on potentially the difference between a small gene therapy company trying to make this work in the European markets versus a company like Novartis that may have the resources to do some of this more sustained work.
And there's also been a broader history in Europe on the cell side. There's at least a half a dozen cell-based technologies that have had good data. So data evidence is the starting point, but it's getting through the systems and weathering the storm. That's also there are many companies that have had to pull out operations over the years in this particular space in a world where stakeholders are coming up very steep learning curves.
So I'm going to ask one more question in the panel, and then I'll turn it to you in the audience. Eric, you mentioned the challenges around pricing and reimbursement for products that go through accelerated regulatory schemes.
Yeah.
And this was a big topic at the ASGCT Policy Summit a few weeks ago, too. And I know in our prep session you had some strong opinions about this. So I'm wondering if you can kick us off in terms of talking about your feelings of how you would think about approaching accelerated regulatory pathways from a pricing and reimbursement standpoint.
So, everyone can see the commercial benefits intuitively of an accelerated process, but Having spent, so one of the things that I've done for almost 20 years is work with National Association of Managed Care Physicians, which is a 20,000 member payer and provider organization, and the payers have been quite clear with accelerated access, at least in the US, but some of the thinking may also be relative to other markets where, again, it can be the fast track to reimbursement. And so the best thing you can do is prepare in advance. You have to start very early because with these therapies, you have a small, short window trial for something that will last a lifetime, and you have to prove magnitude and durability of effect, and in a transformative way. If you can't prove transformative effect, especially if there's something already there, you have to think about what evidence you're going to need. You have to sort of test it to understand. So it goes beyond your clinical program. You have to think about your real-world evidence. Where are the gaps? Where are the questions? What are the pressure points? And start as early as possible. So if you're starting, just before 6 months before your pivotal, you're probably going to be in trouble. You have to start well before to think about it because the risk, you only get a shot at this. And so you have to think about evidence development early and in a more integrated way and align it with solid reimbursement and access planning. So if you look then at diseases that are long-term chronic diseases where it may take 20 or 30 years for the disease effect to happen, then you have other issues like you may have a surrogate. Well, how well validated is that surrogate? The reason the Hep C products went off a viral titer is because there was an encyclopedia set of publications that could show what a viral titer means. But in some rare diseases, in some areas, if you don't have a good link of that surrogate to what payers and HTA organizations would consider hard endpoints, you've got to be creative. That's where things like the maze navigation and other stuff come in to fill in gaps. Don't be limited. Aside from what regulatory requires, don't be limited. You really have to think, do we need to rethink how we define a transformative effect in this space? Because if you don't, then you'll have uphill battle challenges, at least from an evidentiary standpoint.
Eric, you bring up a great point, which is, and I want to speak specifically about the accelerated approval pathway here in the US.
Yeah.
What we're facing now is a complete lack of nuance, I think, in the discussion, where every accelerated approval therapy is painted with the same broad brush instead of looking at the specific evidence package associated with that therapy. So I think it's also important to note that very few cell and gene therapies have actually gone through accelerated approval. Many more of them receive breakthrough designation. They go through what some would call the full approval process. I hate that term, but I'll use it to distinguish it here. And so I want to make sure that we're distinguishing sort of where the challenge actually is. I still think that this could be a real role for some of the innovative contracting models that we started off this conversation discussing, because payers' ultimate concern is always going to be, is this therapy, do we have enough evidence in the clinical package to really judge the effectiveness and the safety of this therapy? And if we don't, how do we know that giving access to this therapy is going to be an overall positive thing for our beneficiaries as well as for our bottom line? And the innovative contracting models can be that bridge, especially for therapies, regardless of the approval pathway at FDA, that have some of those questions associated with them when they come to market.
But I also think that means that the manufacturers actually have to follow through with the data requirements that they set out to do. And I think that that's where payers have a lot of skepticism, is that they don't see that long-term data. And so being able to provide that, whether it's through an innovative contract or registry or some sort of outcomes, to actually show payers that even if you only have a set amount of data at launch, that you're still continuing to collect that data. And I think we have to fulfill our commitments for that in order for the pathway to be used in the appropriate way.
There was the Orchard example brought up earlier, with the example of having 10 years of data. So that's sort of an outlier on some level, right? I mean, but looking at every way that is, you have the evidence base for when these therapies go into a patient, every one matters from a pricing and reimbursement standpoint, because you're coming with limited data at the time of launch. You won't have had years of registry development. Every patient that you can show the longest time horizon possible, even perhaps if the numbers are not statistically significant, is part of that reason to believe that there's that bridge to transformative effect that's enabled.
Thank you. Looks like we have a question here in the second row.
Here we go.
Thanks. Great discussion. My name is Qasim Akras, and I lead the translational access and outcomes research for Novartis Gene Therapies for pipeline products. My question is to Kristin and to Sarah. We operate within the international reference pricing system, by and large, in most of the world. And I can understand why Bluebird would make a decision to withdraw. So historically, from a pharma perspective, the difference between US and international markets and the pricing for companies that have tiered pricing did not pose a big challenge to some of the therapeutic areas we operated in. From a cell gene and therapy perspective, because of the high price and affordability challenges in international market, do you believe that allowing for price flexibility and a visible price I'm talking about is a more of a challenge for cell and gene therapy versus traditional pharma model?
You want to go first?
Sure. I was going to say, it's an interesting question. Is it more of an issue for cell and gene therapies? I think where it becomes more of an issue for cell and gene therapies is not necessarily in the pricing conversation uniquely, but in the value conversation. Because generally speaking, the price associated for a chronic disease therapy per treatment reflects only the benefit that the patient is getting in that individual administration until the next time they get an administration. And so what these systems are not accustomed to is associating a single price with a much longer time frame.
Right.
For the effect, and I think that's what we're running up against, but it really is a question more of how transparent and flexible is the comparison in value and what it means to that marketplace rather than just price. I think price is an overly limiting concept, and I wouldn't attribute our decision in Europe solely to price by any means.
Yeah.
But specifically, because when you register a price, most of the countries, they have the forms that they follow in terms of they choose either lowest price of the benchmark markets or the median or mean, depending on the pricing. But so from that standpoint, in countries where you have confidential net pricing strategy, it's not a challenge because you can operationalize. Companies know how to operationalize that from a value perspective to say we'll give the country whatever value is deemed appropriate. But from a visible price standpoint, you don't think that it's a challenge, more of a challenge for the cell and gene?
Yeah, I'll let the others weigh in, but I'll just quickly say that from a visible price perspective, I think there's generally a pretty solid understanding that the visible price in a market is unlikely to be the price that's dominantly paid by those payers, right? In most markets, there is a confidential net pricing scheme that usually exists. And so I don't think certainly we would advocate no one overly rely on the visible prices of things, because that's not an accurate reflection necessarily of the dynamics in the marketplace. And I think that's widely known for the most part. Not among some US government payers, but generally speaking is widely known.
We took a little bit of a different approach, and we said that we were going to price the product at its value and didn't upprice it to give away a discount. We said that that's what it is, and Novartis has control over doing that in the European markets, but I know they've stayed relatively within a price reference band to avoid exactly that one issue. I think that the bigger issue is what Kristin said. Set a price and defend your price. Make sure that you feel good about your price and understand your price. If you're playing games with your price and uploading and discounting here and there, it's a different conversation to have with payers, but I do think it comes back to the value. And do payers understand the value of your treatment with their overall budget impact? I think there's some of the requirements in Europe are much, much higher. But if a product's priced appropriately, the price should not change depending on where it is. And we understand that certain countries have different GDPs and certain levels, and there are exceptions to be made. But if you truly price your product at an appropriate amount, then why should you be giving all sorts of discounts? And why should that change for a cell and gene therapy versus a chronic therapy?
And I agree 100% with the comment that the big learning curve is wrapping your mind around. You can show economic data, you can have conversations, but I think that wrapping, for stakeholders, wrapping their head around, the impact of the longer term therapy is a huge thing that will just take time and some demonstration. Because and then the worry that one might have is for the chronic, longer-term diseases that are harder to prove transformative effect, they also may be much more challenged on pricing than things that we've seen so far that have a clearer, possibly, value proposition. So we'll have to see. The world's waiting, but it could easily be the case.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see that dynamic play out.
Great. Looks like we have another question over here.
I have the box, whatever the box is. Hi, Nicholas Gertler from Gale Atlantic. Maybe two questions, if we can make them quick. One is for Sarah. You mentioned that for Luxturna, you built a value model that was based on the full burden of disease. How did you convince payers to pay for aspects of that value that really fall outside the drugs budget?
Can you say the last part of what? I couldn't hear you.
I'll hold the box
mask,
closer.
Sorry.
So when you built the value case for reimbursement of Luxturna, you mentioned that you compiled the full burden of the disease, including ways of valuing it that jury awards would capture. But drugs budgets usually don't try to deliver that full spectrum of value. So how did you manage that disparity? And if I have another quick question, please. Are you concerned about the cumulative cost of these treatments as you look around, and if more and more of these really exciting development programs come to fruition, that there's going to be a level of net reimbursement that starts to really strain the system?
I didn't hear the last part. Did you guys?
Are we worried about the cumulative cost of cell and gene therapies as more and more come to market?
Okay, I'll answer the first question because that was directly related to Luxturna. So we did the traditional health economic modeling, and we were evaluated by ICER, the Health Technology Assessment Group in the US. And the interesting part of our health economic model for Luxturna is that, for those of you who know health economic modeling, the baseline models really take into account direct medical costs, right? Direct medical costs means drug costs, hospital costs, like the actual cost to the healthcare system. They don't take into account indirect medical costs. And I'm breaking it down very easily because I'm certainly not a great health economist, but I know what the big points are and what we had to deal with. And blindness is not a disease that has any direct medical costs. The direct medical costs are a seeing eye dog, a cane, and a school for the blind, right? There's not a lot of hospitalizations due to it. The blind community can be very agile, can walk around. They accommodate for needs. So the direct costs are very, very low. And particularly for RPE65 inherited retinal disease, there were no other treatments available. So there was no other standard of care, no other drug costs that we were offsetting with Luxturna. But we had very high indirect costs. You have caregivers when you have kids in particular who are blind. You have educational attainment issues. You have workplace issues. Those indirect costs, or the societal costs, were incredibly high. And one of the problems with our economic modeling is that since ICER and many other groups don't take indirect costs into the baseline assessment, they said, well, the value can't be very high. And we spent a lot of time and effort convincing them that you could do your base case model here, but it's really important in a disease like blindness that you take into account the indirect costs. And that's where we were really able to show the value of the product. So we did that, and then we just used the jury awards and the long-term disability claims as a gut check to say, where were we? And they were higher, and we said, look, we priced where we did because of the system constraints, and we wanted to make sure that access wasn't an issue, but the actual economic value of the product when you plug into the models was higher. And so we weighed both of those options, but we thought in a disease like blindness that we could do some gut check on the society aspect, and we used that to corroborate, and it was, somewhat in line with what we were doing. People value their site quite a bit. And we felt very confident that our price was reasonable and fair and would help people get access, and it did.
Can I actually quickly address the second question that
I was
you
just
asked?
going to say, you did much better with the second question.
Which is just to say, there was a time, perhaps a few years ago, when the predictions about how many cell and gene therapies would come to market were overwhelming, I think, to payers, especially in the US, that it was going to be at one point, then Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, this quote that lives in everyone's minds, of the FDA approving 10 to 15 or upwards of 15 cell or gene therapies a year by the time we get to 2025 is the quote that everyone was using. And rather than spur, I think, a lot of payers to get in the game and start collaborating when it comes to innovative ways to make these therapies available while at the same time considering healthcare system sustainability, it made a lot of payers shut down. All those, or all of them rather, than just those that are the most innovative. I think what we've seen over the course of the last couple of years is the realities of developing these therapies. It's really difficult. Bluebirds can certainly speak to that. There are challenges. There's real world issues that get in the way. And what I think that has done is open up the opportunity for the conversation to be more along the lines of, we will get to a point where if we do nothing now in these intervening years, it will be a concern, the cumulative effect of these cell and gene therapies. But we have this opportunity across the board in all of these markets to pilot and pioneer some of these solutions now so that we are in much better shape by the time we do get to the point where we are approved, where regulatory agencies are approving 10 to 20 of these therapies a year.
The other dimension of affordability here, it kind of goes back to rethinking value on some level for long-term effect, but it also is a cash flow issue. So even though alternative payment models where there are staggered payments have been considered, et cetera, under the scenarios where it's a one-time payment, it's also a cash flow problem. There's not a market in the world that can easily absorb the lightning strike of the types of prices that are there, but that's a very different issue. So a new payment model that spreads, et cetera, addresses some of that issue may be one solution that could be considered, and it also defrays some of the affordability because it allows predictability of payment, which is important, but it also allows both on the provider and payer side a little bit of a defraying of that, shock of having to absorb a bolus of cost, and that's relative to all rare diseases as well. In many cases, the NAMCP payers in the United States have really indicated that, Hep C originally made small to mid-sized health plans in the United States go bankrupt. They're worried about the same thing here. They are not going to be, in the United States, they may not be very proactive in exploring new models because of the business incentives, but I think that, again, rethinking, how we address these things on every level is our job and through ARM to be able to keep re-educating, reiterating, sharing best practices as there are breakthroughs in some of these therapies.
I know we've got some more questions in the audience. We are unfortunately out of time, so I'm going to have to call it here and thank our esteemed panel for their insights.
Thank you.